Welcome to She Persisted, the Gen Z mental health podcast. I'm your host, Sadie Sutton. Let's get into it. By the end of this episode, you will know how to change the patterns that are problematic in your life. Next time you are like, I don't know how I got here, but I don't like where I'm at, you're going to make one small change that has a really big result. Hello, and welcome back to She Persisted. We are in studio today if you're watching, and we are doing a solo episode all about how to change the behaviors that it feels like you just spiraled yourself into and don't understand how you got there. And I'm calling this the butterfly effect for mental health. What one small change can we make to have a really big impact on our emotions and the outcomes in our lives? So let's dive in. If you've ever looked back at a situation and wondered, how did I end up here? There is a psychology map for that, and it can actually change the way you react and approach situations next time. I think most of us would agree that Gen Z is more self-aware than ever. We know what's happening, but we still repeat a lot of patterns that are harmful to our mental health or physical health. And one of my favorite skills from DBT is chain analysis, and it shows us why we might repeat these things that we know are harmful, but choose to engage in them anyways. And when we understand the complicated nature of these behaviors, we know why we keep falling into the same patterns. Because every single behavior is not an isolated incident. It's built from tiny connected links that are built up of thoughts, feelings, urges, and choices. So by the end of this episode, you will know how to trace your chain and identify exactly where to break it to change the patterns that are problematic in your life. So we're going to talk about what underlies these problematic dynamics, which is emotions. You guys hear me say this all the time, but emotions are not random. They don't come from nowhere. They are messengers, and they exist to help us survive, communicate with others, and also motivate action. Sadness tells us that we've experienced a loss, and so we isolate and withdraw to avoid losing further resources. Shame tells us that we've gone against one of our values, so we go within to reflect on that and avoid repeating the same transgression in the future. Joy tells us that we have something in our life that we value and want to re-experience, and so we're motivated to go out and acquire more resources and do more things that make us happy. So your brain isn't being dramatic. It's trying to protect you and keep you alive. And to give you guys a little bit more background there, I love this wisdom from the DBT worksheets about emotion regulation. It's helpful to understand why emotions can cause us to act so impulsively or engage in behaviors that seem so intense. And that's because emotions bypass the process of thinking, considering all the options in a situation. They hardwire us to act immediately, again, to help us survive and thrive. And so they can be helpful when we don't have time to think things through. But in today's day and age, we almost always have time to think things through. And so acting without considering the consequences is what can lead to that chaos and overwhelm. Another thing that's challenging here is that I think a lot of us experience our emotions as unchangeable or as a given. We interpret it as a fact about a situation. But our emotions aren't facts, they're a response to facts. And if we assume that our emotions are facts, we use them to justify our thoughts or our actions. And this can cause a lot of problems and a lot of chaos when we ignore the facts and rely only on our emotional responses. So let's dive into why you're experiencing what you are, how you got to that point, and how it's resulting in the choices and behaviors you make in your life. So this is where the DBT chain analysis skill comes in. And if you've ever said to yourself, I don't know why I just did that, this is going to break it down for you. So what we do in a chain analysis is we break down every step of the emotional experience, and then we go and look at these links to see where we could potentially change the outcome. So before we are ever in a situation, we have these things called vulnerability factors. And these are things that make us more susceptible to experiencing intense emotions. So that is things like not sleeping well, having had a big argument with a friend the day before, forgetting to take your meds, being hangry. All of these things have a really big impact on your emotional outcome. And it's not just these simple things that are more related to the biological experience, but it's also your baseline that you're functioning at. If you are going through a really stressful time at school, if you have family members that are struggling with their health, all of these things add to that baseline level of functioning and mean that we're more vulnerable to experiencing our emotions in a way that's ineffective. And so, on top of these vulnerability factors, we have a prompting event. And this is what initially invokes the emotion. You get a text, you see someone you weren't expecting to, you get a grade on a test, and it's not what you want. It's the event that causes the emotional response. And we don't just experience an emotion in response to that, there's a number of things that happen simultaneously. We have an interpretation of the event, so we have thoughts and beliefs about that thing. And we've talked a lot about how you think about things that happen has a lot of power. So if you fail a test and your interpretation is, I'm a bad student, I'm not smart, I am failing this class, we know that there's a lot of negative implications when it comes to how you cope with that situation if you try to problem solve it, and also your self esteem and how you view yourself as a whole. And the inverse is also true. So if you fail the test and you say, I could have studied more, that wasn't reflective of what we learned in lecture, or I didn't do well on this test this time, but I'll do better next time, seeing that situation as specific to that context, independent of your value and you as a person, and also changeable in the future, you have a much more effective outlook on the experience as a whole. So, at the same time that we are interpreting the event and thinking about how we feel about it, there's also all the biological changes that happen. So, this is a lot of what you hear about on TikTok with fight or flight, rewiring your nervous system. This is the part of the emotional experience that a lot of people speak to and work to change. So, there's a lot of nervous system changes that happen. You might feel more physically tense. You might feel your heart rate increase. You might be more aware of your surroundings or less aware of your surroundings. This is the emotional response that is physical as well as mental. And then you have your experience. So there are those bodily sensations, those feelings that we're having about the experience in response to the event, and then also the action urges. Are you feeling motivated to go to office hours and argue for a better grade? Is your emotion telling you to go back to your dorm and isolate and withdraw and have a pity party about that test for the rest of the day? In addition to the biological changes and the experiences, we also have the expressions of the emotion. So, this is our face and body language. These are your words, what you say, but also what you think, and your actions. And these two things feed into each other. How you express the emotion impacts how you experience it and the biological changes, but your experience of the emotion and the biological changes also inform how you express the emotion. And at any point within this process of experiencing and expressing the emotion, we have an opportunity to name the emotion, to recognize what we're experiencing, to be more aware of it, to then adjust the experience and expression. But alternatively, what a lot of us do is instead of naming the emotion, naming it to tame it, and being aware of the situation to then change it, instead, a lot of us will go back to that initial prompting event by experiencing a secondary emotion, by feeling something about the way we're feeling. So you fail the test, you get the bad grade, you then feel really sad about your performance. You wanted to do better, you wanted a better grade, you expected more of yourself. You then start to feel angry about, why didn't I do better? Why am I not a natural test taker? You are now having a second emotion in response to the initial event. And so we call this a secondary emotion and an after effect. And then we have a second prompting event, which is our additional emotional response to our first emotional response. And so you can see how this becomes a really overwhelming, chaotic experience that you're just feeding into yourself with these potentially negative thoughts and experiences, not naming and understanding your experience, and just causing a larger and more overwhelming reaction. And so, what we'll learn is how to break that cycle, to stop that thought spiral from happening and change the outcome, but also the experience of the emotion and how we express it. And to zoom out a bit bigger picture, in the moment, it's not fun to be like really caught up in the emotional experience and overwhelmed with what you're feeling and just like feeding into that experience. But what a lot of us do when we experience a negative emotion is that we try to escape or avoid that experience because it's not fun, it's not enjoyable, it's uncomfortable. And in our attempt to escape or avoid it, we engage in these problem behaviors or ways of coping with the experience that are not effective. And you experience relief that is temporary and momentary. You don't get the experience to learn how to approach this differently in the future. You don't learn new skills. You don't build that sense of mastery. And then you, in turn, have another vulnerability factor, which is that the next time you experience this emotion or this stressor, you're more likely to do that same thing, which is feel a negative emotion, escape or avoid it, engage in the problem behavior for temporary relief, and never learn to be aware and adjust the experience. So, not only is there a lot of implications around the experience in the moment, but also what will happen in the future and how you will respond to stress next time you experience it. So, the best part of DBT is that we always have a choice when we react. We might not be able to avoid the initial emotion, we might not be able to avoid those automatic thoughts that come up, but we can either choose a path of judgment or a path of mindfulness. And so, when we approach the situation with judgment, that's our interpretations, our assumptions, we're comparing it, we're asking ourselves, well, what would that other person do in this situation? Why am I not acting that way? And that path leads us to self regulation, shame, anger, fight or flight, shutting down, really having a negative experience mood wise. Versus when we go with the path of mindfulness and notice what are we experiencing? What are the facts of the situation? Accepting these are the cards that I'm dealt at this point. What can I do going forward? We then are regulating our emotions. And that's skills like radical acceptance, opposite action, breathing, and grounding. So, chain analysis is looking at all these individual components of the emotional experience and our response. And we can really simplify it. It's those vulnerability factors. So, what did we come into the situation with already kind of being at a loss? Were we tired? Were we stressed? Were we sleep deprived? The prompting event, what happened that resulted in the emotion? And then we have these links that we can disrupt. So, how we thought about the experience, what the bodily sensations were, like the physical experience of the emotion itself, the urges that were associated with experiencing the emotion, and then what actions we took to either cope with that experience or try and change it. And the consequences are, in true DBT fashion, a dialectic, which is that short-term relief versus long-term pain, and understanding how we want to approach the situation so that it's easier for us to navigate next time. And again, avoidance feels good for those 5 minutes, but it's the reason that you're stuck in this cycle. So how should you be approaching this in your day-to-day life? The first thing is understanding what is the problem behavior that I am analyzing. And I don't want you to just limit yourself to a behavior, though that's likely what you're analyzing if you're in DBT or in crisis. But the problem behavior could also be avoidance. It could be things like not being vulnerable and asking for help when you go through a challenging emotional experience. It could be the way that you think about the experience, like we talked about how you respond to a failing grade on a test. It could be that secondary emotion, like having those thoughts that led to anger or shame or lashing out. But it can also be these really tangible actions that we take in response to our emotions that oftentimes make things worse. So, after something bad happened, did you avoid? Did you not tell anyone? Did you punish yourself for the experience? What are the ineffective ways that you responded to that emotion? And you guys have heard me say this before, but if we don't have awareness, we can't take action to change the experience. So, really understanding what you want to change allows you to shift that experience. But if you don't know if you're targeting the thought or the emotion or the behavior or the conversation you had, you're not able to adequately approach, understand, and change that situation. The other part of a chain analysis, which people tend to get wrong, is the prompting event, which is that a lot of times when we think about why we're experiencing an emotion, we attach a lot of judgments and responses to the initial prompting event. So if you get in an argument with a family member, you might be like, the prompting event was my sister was rude, or my brother was annoying, or If you failed the test, you might label the prompting event as, I'm a horrible test taker. But that's not the prompting event. That's your interpretation of and your response to the prompting event. And we need to be really clear on objectively what occurred, purely describing the facts that took place. So the prompting event would be like, I got a phone call. I received a grade back on a test. Like, what can you observe and not attach any judgments to? Because again, your interpretation of it, your thoughts about it, how you felt are those subsequent links in the chain and how you responded to that initial thing. And after we are able to solve the event, we also again think about what were our vulnerability factors. And I think vulnerability factors was something that allowed me to give myself a lot more grace and experience my emotions less intensely. Because one of the best ways to self-validate or for others to validate us is to say, it makes sense that you feel that way. It makes sense that that would be your response. It doesn't mean that it's a justified response, but when we understand kind of the cards that were stacked against us or the things that led to this emotional response, we're able to give ourselves more grace and recognize that it wasn't this isolated event that led to this feeling. It was a combination of the stress from the last week and the last month and how I slept last night and if I was hungry and all of these other factors that also contribute to the experience. Because emotions don't occur in isolation, our responses don't either. And when we can understand that, we can really break down the experience and target a really specific part of it to then change the rest of the chain. So when you're doing a chain analysis, you've identified, okay, what was the problem behavior? What was the prompting event purely objectively, no judgments attached? Then you go through every single thing that followed. So the actions, the sensations, the thoughts you had, the events that occurred, the feelings, the emotions you felt about the feelings you were having. Getting really, really detailed and understanding how this cascade of events occurred and how you ended up in this chaotic thought spiral outcome. And when we're able to break it down and understand it in this way, it doesn't feel as overwhelming and out of our control because we can really clearly see, okay, A led to B and B led to C, and that's how I ended up in this spot. But I can also do things differently next time and get a different outcome. It feels less out of control. It feels less overwhelming. And there are actual steps you can take to improve the experience. And in my early days of DBT, almost every single session, I was doing a chain analysis. And sometimes it was like, why didn't I call for skills coaching when I was in crisis? Or why did I engage in this problem behavior despite the fact that we talked about last time I would try to avoid doing that this week? Or why did I have that giant argument with my parents? That was the most stressful thing since the last time I was in a session. And in the moment, I think there's like the voice in the back of your mind that's like, I know what I should do, but I'm not going to do that. When we break it down into these really specific parts of the experience, it's much easier to make a tiny change that then shifts the outcome versus trying to get yourself to approach the situation in a completely different way, because it feels a lot safer to do what we've done before. And it can be really overwhelming to try and approach a situation completely differently and rehaul the whole experience. So this feels a lot more doable. It feels less overwhelming to change one tiny link of the chain and therefore adjust the outcome, rather than doing a complete overhaul. Because doing so, I think you're really setting yourself up for failure by expecting yourself to do something completely different that you've never done before, despite having a really reinforced pattern of response and behavior. It's unrealistic as an expectation to set for yourself, and then you feel more shame and anger, and then you're in a whole other emotional response. So it's really the butterfly effect for emotional experiences. One small shift can completely change the outcome, but you can't make that shift unless you understand how the cards fell. And like I said, I was doing chain analyses on the weekly in therapy sessions. I was doing them outside of sessions. There was an abundant lack of understanding as to how I was getting myself in these really ineffective ways of coping with things, why I was reacting so ineffectively to these seemingly inconspicuous prompting events. And I wasn't going through these steps of understanding in my head. It wasn't something that was naturally happening, that like, oh, I have this conversation and that is actually reminding me about this like negative belief I had, or this conflict that I had last week, or I just go right into that negative way of coping because it's what I've always done before, or I'm avoiding because this is uncomfortable and I don't want to sit with this. There was not that understanding of what was happening, and so the emotional experience felt really overwhelming and out of my control, and I would just end up in this really bad spot without understanding how I got there, but also how I could change it in the future. So when we break it down to be really micro little steps, we're able to shift that and change that, which is a really empowering experience and gives you a lot more control over the outcome. So essentially, when I was in treatment, I was using this to figure out why every single tiny setback was turning into an entire spiral. And once I saw the links between each step, I finally had options about how I could change the situation. So if you are confused about how a chain analysis works, why this can have an impact on the outcome, I want you to remember that you can't delete emotions, but you can rewrite the sequence that they occur in. So we're going to go through a real life chain analysis example, one that I think almost all of us can relate to, which is doom scrolling. And I think that's an example of something that happens seemingly automatically, that you're not understanding how you got 45 minutes down the TikTok For You page and didn't do any of those other goals that you set for yourself. But when we unpack it as a chain analysis, we're able to understand exactly how we got there and what we can do differently next time. So I will do this for me, but you plug and play your situation, your context to understand the outcome. So my most common doom scrolling time is I will get back from work and I will sit on the couch and I will start scrolling on TikTok, and all of a sudden it's been an hour, and then I decide, oh, well, like I don't have that much time left. I can't do work and it's kind of late. So like it's not really a great time to like eat dinner because then I can't go to the gym, but I don't really want to go to the gym because then I'm going to have to make dinner. And then I end up doing none of the things. I don't do work. I don't go to the gym. I don't end up eating dinner until really late and it's not planned. And then I'm like, okay, I did nothing with my evening except for doom scroll because I convinced myself that was the only reasonable path forward. So in that situation, the vulnerability is that I'm a little bit brain dead. I've been at work for 9 hours. I'm tired. I haven't eaten since lunch. Maybe I didn't sleep super great the night before, so I'm not operating at my best. Maybe it was a stressful day at work. Maybe there was a project we were working on. That is the vulnerability. The prompting event is me getting home and sitting on the couch. You can kind of adjust this, but I think it's helpful to think about it from a habit lens of like we have a cue and a response. And for me, the cue is if I'm sitting on the couch, I will then take out my phone and open TikTok and scroll. So it would be harder for me to say, I'm going to sit on the couch and then change the behavior to I'm going to read a book or I'm going to call someone, because the cue is sitting on the couch. So if I don't sit on the couch, I'm much less likely to then doom scroll for 3 hours. The prompting event is me getting home and immediately going to sit on the couch. Once I sit on the couch, I say, okay, I'm bored. I have nothing to do. I'm going to open my phone. And once I open my phone, it's almost like that automatic wired reaction of I open TikTok or I open Instagram. Like that's the first thing I do, because when I sit on the couch, I open my phone and then I go on TikTok and then I scroll. When I open TikTok, I see a video that invokes an emotion. Maybe it's funny, maybe it's sad. There's an emotional response. And then I am having a secondary emotion and scrolling to change the emotion or see what's coming next. And then you're having this like whole emotion reinforcement cycle related to scrolling. And that's how you end up doom scrolling, right? Like you end up in this cycle of emotions and experiences that we talked about. And at no point do you intervene and change the outcome. So essentially, I scroll. I then have these thoughts of like, well, it's not a great time for me to eat dinner because then I won't be able to go to the gym later. But also it's like kind of too early to go to the gym now. And also I just got back from work. So like, I don't want to do additional work now. Like these are the thoughts and the interpretations about the prompting event that I'm having. Are they accurate? No, I could do any of those things, but those are the thoughts that I'm having. And then once I am like, well, it's not a great time, so I'll do that later. And then all of a sudden it's been 3 hours. I then am thinking to myself, I did nothing with my afternoon. I have nothing to show for this evening. I could have done something that was more productive and fun. And I feel like low energy and not great about the experience. And now I'm annoyed at myself. I'm having a secondary emotion for scrolling on TikTok for 3 hours. And those are the consequences of the event. And this is something that we don't always take the time to unpack and consider, but the consequences are the reason that we're changing the problem behavior. Behavior might not be great, but if there's not consequences, there's not really the motivation for us to change it. So it's really important to understand, how did other people react, not only in the moment, but later on? How did you feel immediately following the behavior, but also later on? So for me, I was like, okay, I'm annoyed at myself for scrolling for 3 hours. Shame, anger, frustration, anxiety about all the work that I now have to do and things that I didn't end up getting done. Later, I am more likely to repeat the cycle and sit on the couch, open my phone, go on TikTok, and doom scroll. And what effect did the behavior have on the environment, both in the moment and later on? I mean, maybe I didn't like tidy up my apartment or get work done. And that impacts both the productivity or the outcome in the moment, but also the work that I have to do the next day or the day after. And it just like compounds and piles up and then is overwhelming. And then you avoid it by doom scrolling and going on TikTok. So we're able to understand how all of those things happen. And for me, I think the most effective way to change that is not opening TikTok and then trying to get off of TikTok. It's not sitting on the couch and then trying to convince myself to read a book rather than watch entertaining content. What's most effective for me to change, I think, is sitting on the couch, which is that instead, when I get back from work, I put my stuff down and maybe I like put on an outfit to go to the gym, or maybe I immediately start making dinner. Maybe I start tidying things up. Not doing that cue that results in that behavior, that for me is the easiest link to break. And as a result, I don't have the emotional cycle of doom scrolling for 3 hours and then feeling annoyed at myself and then having more work to do and then feeling overwhelmed and then doom scrolling for 3 hours to avoid feeling overwhelmed because I was doom scrolling for 3 hours and caused myself more work down the line. So it's not about being perfect. It's about catching the pattern one link earlier each time. Likely what will happen, and what does happen when I try and shift this behavior, is sometimes I do sit on the couch but do a different activity. Sometimes I do go to the gym, but then I scroll but for less time. It's moving in the right direction and understanding how these things occur and happen so we can insert ourselves and get a different outcome. So if you've never done this before and you're like, this feels really overwhelming and I don't want the really long, extensive, intensive, black and white DBT worksheet, I would just like some nice questions to ask myself to consider. You're going to write the event that happened completely objectively, just the observable facts. You're going to write your thoughts, feelings, actions, and the outcomes in the moment, but also long term. And you're going to highlight or circle where you could pause next time to do something differently. Is it before you sit on the couch? Is it before you look at the response to your test grade? Is it before you send that text? And you're going to circle that moment and decide, what skill could I do to change the outcome? So for me, it's stop. I'm going to pause. I'm going to think, okay, if I sit on the couch, I'm very likely to go down a TikTok rabbit hole and doom scroll for 3 hours. If I don't go on the couch, I will do something different. And maybe I still will like not be super productive and get all the things that I wanted to done, but I won't end up in this doom scrolling shame spiral for 3 hours. And even the understanding is a movement in the right direction, right? Like we don't have awareness, we can't take action to change it. So even just going through the chain analysis, even if you still end up doing the thing, understanding where you could do things differently and why you're getting the outcome that you are in your life is really helpful. So next time you have a behavior or an experience that you want to change, I want you to think about it from this butterfly effect chain analysis framework. One small thing can have a really big impact on the outcome, but if we don't break it down into those little small things, we can't understand where we can insert a skill and be more effective. So remembering that every behavior that you want to change makes perfect sense when you zoom out. That is the power of a chain analysis. It is turning that shame into insight and insight into change. And like we said at the beginning, it's not impossible to change these things. It's not an uphill battle. You're not broken. Your brain is just running a pattern that you now know how to rewrite. So the next time one of your friends or family members says, I don't know why I do this, you're going to send them this episode. You're going to help them do a chain analysis. Next time you are like, I don't know how I got here, but I don't like where I'm at, you're going to do a chain analysis. You're going to unpack how you got to the outcome that you are in, and you are going to make one small change that has a really big result. So as always, make sure to share with a friend or family member, follow it at She Persisted Podcast for more evidence-based tools to help get you mentally unstuck. If you enjoyed this episode of She Persisted, make sure to leave a review, subscribe, and share with a friend or family member. Follow along at She Persisted Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and more for bonus content. Thanks for listening and keep persisting.